We would like to resume the symposium. Next is session number 1, Armitage-Nye dialogue. We distributed to you blue and red paper. We will be using that session. Please make sure you have them at your hands. The facilitator of the session is CSIS Senior Associate, Asia Group Management Principal, Mr. Christopher Johnson. I would like to hand over the microphone to Mr. Johnston. The floor is yours, sir, Mr. Johnston.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Ohayou gozaimasu. My name is Chris Johnstone. I'm a senior associate at CSIS and managing principal at the Asia Group. And the purpose of the session that we have this morning, this first session, is to discuss the implications of recent developments, the US presidential election, of course, the new government here under Prime Minister Ishiba, and the implications of those developments for geopolitics and for the US-Japan alliance. And to do so, I'm really honored to be on the stage with two luminaries who really need no introduction, but just briefly, let me say a few words about them. Ambassador Rich Armitage, to my left, is president of Armitage International and a former deputy secretary of state under George W. Bush. And as everyone here well knows, he is one of the leading figures of the last generation in shaping US policy toward Asia. Welcome, Rich. On the far side is Dr. Joseph Nye, who is University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at Harvard University and the former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, among other important government posts, and is the author of numerous books that have had a profound impact on the study of international relations, including a new memoir entitled A Life in the American Century. Welcome, Joe. So, gentlemen, thank you. We have a lot to talk about. But in the spirit of acknowledging that we have one president at a time, I want to start by taking stock a bit of the Biden administration as we come to the end of 4 years and take a look at the Biden record. I wonder if I could ask each of you to say a few words about how you evaluate the Biden administration's foreign policy, and in particular its strategy toward the Indo-Pacific, and its strengths and weaknesses. Ambassador Armitage, let me start with you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good morning. Thanks for putting up with Dr. Nye and I one more time. The evaluation of the Biden administration from me is very schizophrenic. On the one hand, in Asia, particularly Northeast Asia, I give the Biden administration sometimes B+ marks. The handling of the US-Japan-Korea relationship, the Quad, things of that nature. On the other hand, in Southeast Asia, I think the mark is quite lower, basically having overlooked Southeast Asia, except for the Philippines. Then more broadly, the handling of the Biden administration of Europe, and particularly NATO, I think has been noteworthy. It's kept a lot of cohesion in NATO. I think her handling of Ukraine, however, is somewhat questionable. On the one hand, marshaling international activities to assist arming Ukraine is a good thing, but limiting Ukraine and their ability to actually prosecute the war might be more questionable. I am old school and happen to feel that you don't get the Russian attention until they actually taste their own blood in their mouths. And the Biden administration has held off from that. Finally, the Middle East. I just have to say I don't understand what's happening. I do understand full support for Israel. It's part of the U.S. Approach to Israel historically. But on the other hand, we provide weapons to Israel and then are surprised when Israel uses those weapons in Gaza. Or the Biden administration supplies THAAD air defense to Israel and somehow thinks that can be separated out from Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon activities. We can't. It's all of one piece. So I think the handling of the Middle East has been quite questionable. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. So a B or B plus in some areas and some schizophrenia. Fair enough. Joe, can I invite you to offer some opening thoughts?
I'm very close to Rich on his assessment. So let me just, first of all, say that from the point of view of this audience, I think I'd give him an A for Northeast Asia, in the sense that the U.S.-Japan alliance is stronger than ever. The relations between Japan and Korea are better than we've seen. And if you look at the role of the Quad and getting India involved in the area, not to mention AUKUS, I think this is really first rate. But where I agree with Rich is I think on the Middle East, you can be strongly in favor of helping Israel defend itself, which I am, and look at the way the Biden administration has handled the situation. And Netanyahu has run circles around Biden. I mean, it's one thing to say that Israel has a right of self-defense, which of course it does. But on the other hand, having a capacity to limit the civilian damage is crucial. And while there was one period where Biden was talking about restricting some weapons, that didn't last. And his most recent point about the delivery of aid to northern Gaza, apparently that's not having effect. So I think that on the Middle East, I would give him a lower grade, somewhere in the C or C minus range. So that's the range of grades. I think Rich and I are largely in agreement.
Yeah, so strong marks in Northeast Asia and our alliance relationships, which I think are noteworthy, and then a more mixed record in the Middle East and Ukraine. Let me ask you both more about China policy in particular, to go sort of a level deeper. I mean, the Biden administration took office with the stated intention of focusing on the Indo-Pacific and advancing the strategic competition with China. It was obviously challenged in doing so by the wars that you've mentioned in Ukraine and in the Middle East. But I think always maintain that stated intention to focus on China. How successful do you view the administration's approach to China as we come to the end of these 4 years? And President Biden is about to meet with Xi at APEC, and that will be sort of the culmination of these efforts. How do you evaluate the China policy in particular of this administration? Joe, maybe I'll start with you this time.
Well, I think you have to realize that China plays a role in this. What we've seen is different phases of U.S.-China relationships, usually lasting about 20 years or so. And this latest phase, the phase of engagement basically ends around, 2015 or 2016. And you have Trump's policy of great power competition announced in 2017 instead of engagement. And many people think that, and Biden continues that policy. Many people think that that's Trump that made the difference. I disagree. I think Trump was like a kid who came along and threw gasoline on a fire and it flares up, but that China lit the fire. I think after the Great Recession of 2008, when China drops Deng Xiaoping's cautious policy, you see a much more assertive Chinese policy, and you begin to see the response to this already in the Obama administration towards that later years. And so it's not too surprising that Biden has, in a sense, continued the great power competition as his basic approach to China. How well has he done with it? Moderately well. Remember, he has some very good people running the policy, like Kurt Campbell and Rush Dorsey and others who are very good on China. But the Chinese were ready to engage when the first meetings at Anchorage occurred in 21. The Chinese spent their time berating Sullivan and Blinken rather than talking seriously. And it took at least 2 years or more before you could begin to have serious discussions. I think the reason you got the serious discussions beginning in San Francisco when Xi and Biden meet was because of the downturn in the Chinese economy. So I don't think that China had a change of heart. I think their objectives of increasing their power in the region and in the world at the cost of the United States, I think that's been there since 2008. And I think the administration overall have the right response, which is to say that we're not going to pretend that there's still engagement. We're going to respond in a manner where we're prepared to cooperate where we can cooperate, but with it, competition is going to be tough. And the terminology that they've used, whether it's a managed competition or cooperative coexistence or whatever terminology used, is less important than the fact that I think they were pretty realistic about what Chinese objectives were. And so I'd give them a reasonable grade on that.
Great, thanks, Joe. Rich, what would you have to say on this?
My grade would be slightly lower. I think the administration of Mr. Biden has attempted to deal with China like it was a normal country. And as Xi Jinping were the leader of a normal country. Xi Jinping, in my view, does not care about China. He cares about the party. This is what he cares about, the party. I've said before in different audiences, when I look at Xi Jinping, I actually see Louis XIV of France. And he's intent on doing to China just what Louis XIV did to France hundreds of years ago. So by dealing with China as a normal country, I don't think we can successfully wrap our arms around her to have some success. So obviously, the last 4 years, it's much better to have been talking with our lips than with our hands and our fists with China. But it shouldn't substitute for any sort of progress.
Great. Well, let's now transition to the next president and the prospect of a second Trump administration. Again, let's just start with a broad question. What can we expect broadly from Trump foreign policy? He's talked a lot about America first. There's a fair amount in the Republican Party platform. help us sort out what is likely to take place from what is stated and communicated in rhetoric. Rich, let me start with you again.
Well, as all of you know, I'm a pretty simple guy. So I'm one of those who will take Mr. Trump at his word. You can expect tariffs, global tariffs. The level, I don't think, has been decided, but there will be tariffs. Second, you can expect a transactional, president. He wants to do things transactionally. You do something, and he allegedly will do something in return. Well, we'll see. I don't think that Mr. Trump has any true feelings himself for any other relationship around the globe. This does not mean, however, that his administration will not have those feelings. There will be people in his administration who do want to foster better relations with friends and allies around the world. But it's going to take a while to sort out. So I don't expect any major changes other than rhetorical in the first at least 6 months of the administration.
But just to be clear, Rich, you do expect that he will move quickly on tariffs, as he has stated.
President Trump says the most beautiful word in the English language is tariffs. He has no understanding of tariffs and what they really mean. He has no understanding that if he does do tariffs, almost certainly some European friends, Asian friends are going to respond with tariffs. But since he said it so often and so loudly, I expect it'll be the first thing that we see.
Yeah, I mean, in President Trump's acceptance speech, right, one of the things he said is promises made, promises kept. So I think anticipating he will, in fact, do what he said he would do is a reasonable expectation. Joe, how would you set out the prospects for us?
Well, notice that promises made, promises kept makes sense if there were just a few promises, but there are thousands of promises all over the lot. And so I think you're right about tariffs, but what they're going to mean is very uncertain. In fact, the major thing to think about at Trump's policy is unpredictability or uncertainty. This is, for Trump, this is partly because of the way his mind works. He's often influenced by the last person who's been in to see him. But it's also because he regards unpredictability as his key weapon in bargaining. In other words, if you can't predict me, you're going to concede to me in the bargain we're going to strike. So he cultivates unpredictability. So he's unpredictable by his nature, but he's also unpredictable as a tactic. Let me apply that to this question of tariffs. Yes, there will be tariffs, but notice that he's expressed very many different aspects of tariffs, 10 to 15% on all goods. If to do that, you have to, as president, you have to use a section of the trade law called 232, which allows a president to apply tariffs for national security reasons. That can work when you're talking about steel or aluminum, but it's hard to see how that works if you're talking about cosmetics. So if you have a across-the-board promise of tariffs, you're going to have to go to the legislature. You can't just do that by executive order. And when it gets to the legislature, deals are going to be struck. So will you see 10 to 15% tariffs across the board on everything? Almost certainly not. So promise is kept, but which promise? Similarly with China, we're told we're going to see 60% tariffs. I think you're likely to see something where he will announce 60% tariffs, but it's not out of the question that he could then try to do a deal with Xi Jinping in which he would be able to say, well, I threatened him with tariffs and I got a deal which is producing so and so many jobs for such and such states. And so for this area and this good and that good, we're not levying the 60% tariff. So he likes to have his cake and eat it too. He'll say, yes, I put 60% tariffs on X, but then you won't notice that Y and Z have been bargained away and have no tariffs or 5% tariffs. So I think you're right that he will apply tariffs, but because of his intense transaction nature, don't be surprised if there's some sort of bargaining done, which goes back to this point of tariffs, yes, but at what level and against what goods. But let me, if that's the bad news, let me say something that's in the good news, which is when it comes to China policy and the role of Japan, there's a very strong bipartisan support in the United States about standing up to China. And that means that Japan is absolutely key ally. So if you go back to the 1980s or 90s where there are questions about the US-Japan alliance, those don't exist at all anymore. The importance of the US-Japan alliance is thoroughly rooted and bipartisan. Now, this doesn't mean that Trump won't try to charge you for this. He will ask for more contributions in host nation support, for example, or he may demand certain concessions in certain trade areas. So will it be an easy ride with Trump? No. People used to say that Abe-san was brilliant at managing Trump because he used golf cart diplomacy. I don't know whether golf cart diplomacy will still work. So there'll be difficulties in the US-Japan alliance, but there will not be real threats to the US-Japan alliance such as we saw 40 years ago. So that, I think, is predictable. Having started by saying everything is unpredictable, I would feel pretty secure on that prediction.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. And I do want to come back to this question of impact on the US-Japan relationship and what we can expect going forward. But I just wanted to highlight one point I think both of you alluded to, and this question of tariffs, right? Ultimately, what is the purpose? Is the purpose to facilitate a more aggressive decoupling of the US economy from China? Or is it to set the stage for the kind of negotiations that you suggested, Joe, might be possible by establishing leverage at the outset? I think that's an uncertainty that we have as we think about the direction of US-China relations. But let me turn to the question of Taiwan and salt in here a question we have from the audience. The first Trump administration, I think, was pretty good for Taiwan in a lot of ways, right? When you think about major arms sales packages, engagement at more senior levels in the US government, more frequent displays of US military commitment, resumption of regular Taiwan Strait transits, for example, by naval ships that the Biden administration has very much continued. But Trump has also been critical of Taiwan recently, including levels of defense spending. He suggested that Taiwan sort of took away the US semiconductor industry. So some mixed messages, I think it's fair to say, about Taiwan. How do you expect that he and his team will approach the Taiwan question? And will we see a continuation of the approach that we saw 4 years ago? Or I should say 8 years ago, sorry. Rich, let me start with you on that.
Well, I think, Chris, first of all, it's too soon to tell. The reason I say that is, look at the personnel who were in the first Trump administration, people who cared about Taiwan, Matt Pottinger, Randy Schriver, and others. So there was a center of gravity in the first Trump administration that could move things, particularly before Mr. Trump had any understanding of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. You'll remember Dr. Tsai Ing-wen telephoned President Trump. He had no idea who Tsai Ing-wen was. He took the call, much to the chagrin of the Chinese. So I think in the first instance, our Taiwan friends can expect more pressure on defense spending. I think the second instance, it's been noticed that Japan and others, particularly European countries, have been very interested in joining the United States in activities in the South China Sea, sometimes in the Taiwan Strait. So this has to have an effect, certainly on the U.S. military. But the open question is how much influence the U.S. military is going to have. And it is an open question. Some in the Trump administration are openly calling for the removal of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. So there are going to be a lot of twists and turns before we get to sort of a bottom line on Taiwan. And it will be affected by a lot of things, not the least of which will be the nomination hearings of some people for the Trump administration.
Certainly. Joe, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I agree with what Rich said, but let me just add a couple of points. Trump doesn't have a visceral feeling for Taiwan. In other words, he, as Rich said, he sees Taiwan as freeloading. TSMC has taken away the American chip industry, not done enough with its plant in Arizona to replace that. So, and not spent enough on defense. So there's going to be a series of complaints. In that sense, I think if I were in Taipei, I would expect I would have to pay a bill to keep the support. I don't see Trump issuing statements like President Biden did. President Biden 4 times said, I will come to the defense of Taiwan. And 4 times the White House staff said, this is not policy, the policy is the traditional policy since Nixon and Mao of one China. I don't expect they're going to change, I don't think they're going to change the one China policy. I don't expect there's going to be promises of support. But I think the questions of what real support Taiwan will get will depend in part on what Taiwan purchases in terms of weapons. If I were Taiwanese, I would announce a very large weapons purchase from the United States and point out the number of jobs that it would provide in the United States. So I would take the initiative on that. The other thing I would worry about if I were Taiwanese is if Trump were to do a deal with Xi Jinping of the type I described a few minutes ago, would he be quite willing to sell out Taiwan's interests And I fear the answer to that is yes. So while I think Japanese can be feeling quite secure, even if the Trump administration follows what it said so far, I think Taiwanese ought to be more nervous and ought to do more of developing their own capacity for self-defense, both fancy weapons which will make a splash in the United States, but even more important, ship missiles which are portable and can be hidden in caves and not preempted by a first strike and so forth. So I think the Taiwan case is more complex.
Yeah, and certainly there are signs that our Taiwan friends are also somewhat nervous about what's coming, and some of the reporting we saw last week about plans for a significant increase in defense spending and perhaps a request for significant new arms purchases from the United States reflects, I think, some of that nervousness. Let me move on to another question we have from our audience, which relates to the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, one of the most alarming recent geopolitical developments is North Korea's rapidly deepening relationship with Russia, including the deployment, apparently, of thousands of North Korean troops to fight and support the invasion of Ukraine. Trump, of course, in his first term, sought closer ties with both President Putin and Kim Jong-un. Has suggested, at least in some ways, a similar approach the second time around. How do you each assess the way he is likely to approach the Korean Peninsula? And the other issue I call to mind for you that perhaps you could comment on, Trump also considered significant reductions in the U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula as well. He hasn't said as much about that this time, but do you anticipate that could be on the agenda as well? Joe, let me start with you, the Korean Peninsula.
Well, the question of whether Trump will have the same illusions that he had when he met with Kim Jong-un is totally unpredictable. Remember, in 2017, he was threatening a rain of fire on the Korean Peninsula. In 2018, he announced that he'd fallen in love with Kim Jong-un. It took 2 summits before they fell out of love. But in terms of predicting how Trump will try to deal with North Korea, there's an example of what I started with. Anything I said as a prediction, don't believe me. On the other hand, on South Korea, while he threatened to withdraw troops, we have about 28,000 troops in South Korea now. While he threatened to withdraw them, as Rich said, part of this will depend on who his key advisors are. It would be a very foolish move, but if he doesn't withdraw them, he's going to charge a higher price for them. And Korea pays about a little over $1 billion a year in terms of host nation support. Trump has announced that he wants to increase that 10 times, 10 billion. That's a big increase in the bill. But that strikes me as more predictable than what he's going to do with Kim Jong-un.
The question of Mr. Trump's approach to North Korea can be measured by the number of flashbulbs that the press has. If he announces and then shows up for a meeting with Kim Jong-un. That's what Mr. Trump cares about. And certainly Kim Jong-un understands that. Regarding South Korea, it's it's not a secret that President Trump and President Moon, previously South Korea, had a bad relationship. I think President Yoon, the president, will have a much better relationship. And I think our Korean friends are much better placed right now to deal with a transactional president, getting ahead on host nation support, getting ahead perhaps on some shipbuilding for the U.S., things of this nature. At least there's some good argumentation on the Korean side this time, unlike before. Chris, you raised the question of Korean troops in Ukraine. This is not frivolous. A large number of North Korean troops on the European continent is a big deal. And my personal view is the more quickly Ukraine can chew them up, the better. The more quickly Ukraine can look for ways to exacerbate the Russian-Korean bad feelings, which already exist, the better. My personal view is that Mr. Trump has no real sense of the significance of North Korean troops on the European continent. So it's going to be up to Mr. Zelensky and his colleagues to bring this home very vividly to Mr. Trump. I don't want to leave the impression that Kim Jong-un, or as I say, Kim 3.0, actually cares about his soldiers. Of course he doesn't. But I think we have to make a statement to the European continent that we can't allow this sort of behavior.
Yeah, certainly this is an issue that probably hasn't gotten the attention it deserves in the United States either. And Europe, one of Europe's, I think, first issues to confront will be how to sustain and if to sustain support for Ukraine in an environment in which U.S. support is possibly waning. Let's now turn to the U.S.-Japan relationship and what we can expect in a second Trump administration. As you alluded to earlier, Japan benefited really, I think, quite strongly from the close relationship that Abe Shinzo had with President Trump. I think it was actually a pretty good 4 years in the U.S.-Japan relationship. The landscape is obviously very different today with different leaders, a different leader in place in Japan. How do you think about the U.S.-Japan relationship under Trump 2.0? And really, what advice would you offer to our Japanese friends and the Ishiba administration for how to approach what's coming? Rich, maybe start with you.
You know, I am not in the position to offer advice to the Prime Minister of Japan. But I have some suggestions generally. The first thing is, don't try to be Mr. Trump's friend. Just try to have an appropriate relationship, a workmanlike relationship. As I understand it, nobody internationally really is Trump's friend. Mr. Abe worked rigorously on the Trump relationship. But if I thought that Mr. Abe would stand here, or could stand here, and tell you he had a close relationship with Trump, I don't think he would. But he made things work. And I suspect that there's a large enough body in the United States, in our Congress, and some in his administration who will not be loose and fast with the U.S.-Japan relationship. I think we're somewhat more solid than that because of the hard work of many of you and many of folks Dr. Nye, Dr. Henry, Nixon, Jenny, and others in the audience have really worked to solidify this.
I agree with what Rich said. Abe was as they say, a Trump whisperer. A friend of mine in the Gaimu show said that what you did is you let Trump win a hole or two, and then on the next round in the golf cart, you mentioned the issue that you wanted to get help with. I'm not sure Mr. Ibshib's golf game is up to that, but I do think the basic point is correct, that Trump is very transactional rather than a deep, warm relationship. But having a decent relationship is very important, something which doesn't threaten Trump's ego. So in that sense, a Japanese prime minister has to be careful what he says and how he picks. If there will be issues, but how they're framed and how they're developed are going to have to be handled carefully. But I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is because of the concern about China, which is a challenge both to Japan and to the U.S., I think we're fated to stay together. In other words, there'll be friction, there'll be problems, but basically the larger geopolitical situation means that the U.S.-Japan alliance remains, as Mike Mansfield once put it, the most important alliance in the world.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Thinking about when you all did the first Armitage-Nye report in 2000, none of this was obvious at that time, right? That China would become such an anchor in our relationship and the foundation of the cooperation that we see, and it does give it a durability. But let me ask you about the most recent Armitage-Nye report that we put out in April of this year, just before Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Washington. This was the sixth report that we put out since that you put out since October of 2000, and it calls for a pretty ambitious vision for the U.S.-Japan relationship. It calls for, quote, an alliance that is more integrated, from planning and executing military operations to linking economic and security concerns, including by coordinating industrial policy and promoting secure supply chains. And it lays out a whole set of recommendations. Let me ask you, in light of the new administration that's coming in Washington, is this agenda still realistic for the U.S.-Japan relationship? Were the recommendations that we offered, and I was part of that team also, are still realistic? Do they still stand as we go forward? Joe, let me maybe start with you.
I still think that's the direction we should be going. Deeper integration of our forces is very much in both of our interests. There are a couple of things, though, that were in our earlier reports which may be harder to deal with. One is the intelligence questions. We had suggested about sort of developing the intelligence relationship so that Japan would be de facto the sixth eye of the Five Eyes. I think there's going to be enough uncertainty in the intelligence world when we look at the rumored appointments that Trump has suggested. And I don't see progress in that area. The other idea, which is one we suggested, I don't know, a couple of reports ago, which was to have more joint bases which add a Japanese flag and Japanese control, a little bit like Misawa that would be a long-term approach to avoiding the kinds of problems that we've seen developing in Okinawa. I don't see much progress on that, though I'd still like to see it.
It's interesting, Prime Minister Ishiba has also raised that as a possible agenda item in some of what he's written in the past, the idea of moving toward truly joint bases. Yeah, Rich?
Yeah, I think that, Chris, looking at Dr. Nye's and my latest report, as you point out, the sixth report over 24 years. Joe, did you ever think we'd be doing this for 24 years? I think you have to look at where it started. We started by saying we wanted to advance toward a mature partnership. And then we went right through over the next several iterations, getting Asia right, but getting Japan right, anchoring Asian stability, anchoring global stability. Finally, the integrated relationship, which you're talking about. Can this happen? And is it still realistic? Absolutely. Dr. Nye has correctly pointed out the problems that we have. 5 eyes turning to 6 eyes will be a difficult one under a new administration. But beyond that, if you look, Japan is already moving towards a new command relationship for herself, and to be complete by March of 25. The U.S. is looking for a new relationship with our own forces by changing our command and control to make it a better partner, a more reliable partner, a more cohesive partner for Japan. You know, look what happened every day. You can read in the Japanese newspaper that somebody else, mainly in Europe, wants to develop some sort of deeper security relationship with Japan. Part of this is Japan is seen as, to some extent, taking the place of the United States at a time of some questions because of the Trump administration. But I think it's also a testimony to the fact that Japan's own capabilities and reach and thought extends now far beyond the home islands of Japan. And let's face it, why are all of you here today? Are you here because you love the United States? No. Why are your American friends here today? Is it because we love Japan? No. We respect Japan. We enjoy it. We like the people of Japan. But at the end of the day, Japanese and Americans enjoy this relationship because they've individually made cold calculations of their own national security and have come up to the point where they realize this cold calculation ends with a strong U.S.-Japan relationship.
Rooted in interest and not just affinity. Yeah, very well said. Please,
Chris, could
Joe.
I just add, I mean, I agree with this, but could I have one point, which is we've stressed very strongly the military integration, which I fully agree with. But let's not forget the role that Japan can play with its soft power, and particularly the role of JICA. I mean, if you look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, trying to curry favor with countries across the world, including the South Pacific Islands, essentially here's an area where Japan is better suited than the United States. And so in that sense, the role of JICA and Japanese aid and Japanese soft power shouldn't be forgotten when we talk about the strength of this alliance.
Yeah, and another point that you make in the report is that we are entering a period in which Japanese leadership is going to be more important than ever, both in the region and beyond, because of some of the issues that will be consuming the United States at home. We have only a few more minutes here, so let me maybe ask just one more question, again from the audience. And this relates, the question here is about the Quad and the future of the Quad under Trump 2.0. But let me maybe broaden this question out, because I think one of the signature features of the Biden approach to East Asia was this emphasis on minilateralism, building closer ties, not just with US allies bilaterally, but promoting closer relationships among them. US-Japan ROK being the best example, but also the US, Japan, and Australia. The Philippines has become increasingly important under President Marcos. So this sense of a minilateral, a lattice work, I think is the word that the Biden administration uses. And the Quad was certainly a part of that. What is the future of these efforts under a Trump administration? Do they have enough momentum on their own to persist, or are they more fragile than that and therefore somewhat at risk? How do you think about the future of minilateralism in Asia? Rich, let me start with you again.
On the question of the Quad, first of all, if you look at the leadership of the nations, they have a fair to good relationship with Mr. Trump. I think that argues well, and again, it argues well because not only do they have a relationship, but we have the same interest in many cases. Not in all cases, but in many. And these are sort of mini arrangements, if you will, if I can use another term. These coalitions of the willing are actually very comfortable because they can be created for one issue, but they don't tie a nation's hands like a defense treaty. They can be for one issue, but then if another issue crops up, there's no automaticity to having everybody report. Therefore, I think it's much more comfortable. So I think as we move to the future, great defense treaties are in the past, but these coalitions of the willing are in the future.
An optimistic take, that's great. Joe?
I agree with that. I just add that if you take the Quad, what's interesting is to see the extent to which India has become involved and interested in East Asia. This actually begins in the Trump, well, it begins before that in the Bush administration, but it continues in the first Trump administration. I'd expect it will be continuing in the second Trump administration. I think the most important point, though, is Rich mentioned that if you tried to form this into a defense treaty, it wouldn't work. When you talk to the Indians about that, there's still a vestigial sense of non-alignment as part of an ideology. So anything that looks like a formal defense treaty, they would resist. But can you get them involved on a number of issues which are critically important, including maritime exercises? Absolutely. So I think this minilateralism is the right approach.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to note that it was really under President Trump that the Quad was elevated first. And of course, the Biden administration built on that, but it was really Trump that sort of added some new momentum to it. And the other observation I would have is that if you talk to Biden administration officials, India became a real driver of the Quad agenda. at the leader level as that process got started. So I think that speaks to this note of optimism about momentum and durability in some of this nascent, non-formal security treaty cooperation that we're seeing in the region. Well, with that, we have reached the end of our time. Rich and Joe, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here on the stage with you. Please, audience, join me in a round of applause for Rich. Thank you very much.
Armitage-sama.
Ambassador Armitage, Professor Nye, Mr. Johnston, thank you so much. Please join me once again with a great round of applause to all the three speakers.